The Montana sun beat down on the asphalt of Rocky Ridge truck stop, creating those shimmering heat waves that made the distant mountains look like they were dancing. It was mid-July, and the temperature had already climbed to 95 degrees by 10 in the morning. I pulled my brand-new Peterbilt 579 into the lot, the chrome gleaming like a mirror, the custom midnight blue paint job turning heads as I rolled past the fuel pumps. This wasn't just any truck. This was $200,000 of cutting-edge engineering, my dream machine, equipped with every technological advancement the industry had to offer. Adaptive cruise control, collision mitigation, lane departure warning, a diagnostic system so advanced it could predict maintenance issues before they happened. I'd spent 3 years saving for the down payment and another 2 years of brutal cross-country hauls to make the monthly payments. But now, at 32 years old, I was finally driving the truck I'd always wanted. My name is Derek Matthews, and I'd been hauling freight for 12 years. Started when I was 20, fresh out of a failed semester at community college, desperate for work that paid better than flipping burgers. My uncle got me a job with a regional carrier, and I fell in love with the road, the independence, the solitude, the ever-changing scenery outside my window. Over the years, I'd worked my way up from driving beat-up day cabs on short runs to owning my own rig and contracting with premium freight companies. I stepped down from the cab, my boots hitting the pavement with a satisfying thud. The truck stop was busy, as it always was on a Saturday morning. Drivers milled around the lot, some heading into the diner for breakfast, others doing their pre-trip inspections or catching up on sleep in their cabs. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with the aroma of bacon and coffee from the restaurant, creating that unique truck stop atmosphere I'd come to know so well. "Derek! Man, is that really yours?" I turned to see Tommy Rodriguez jogging over, his eyes wide with admiration. Tommy was a younger driver, maybe 25, still running an older Freightliner for a company out of Wyoming. Good kid, eager to learn, always asking questions about the business. "All mine," I said, unable to keep the pride out of my voice. I ran my hand along the smooth fender. "Just picked her up from the dealer 2 weeks ago. Full warranty, top-of-the-line everything." Tommy walked around the truck slowly, taking in every detail. "Man, this is incredible. What's she got under the hood?" PACCAR MX-13 engine, 5 and 10 horsepower, automated transmission with predictive cruise control. The computer system in this thing is more advanced than what NASA used to land on the moon. I wasn't exaggerating much. The digital dashboard looked like something out of a spaceship, with multiple screens displaying everything from fuel efficiency to tire pressure in real time. "What's something like this run you?" Tommy asked, though I could tell from his expression he already had a rough idea. "Just north of 200 grand, fully loaded, but she'll pay for herself. The fuel efficiency alone saves me about 800 a month compared to my old truck. And with all these safety features, my insurance is actually lower." We stood there for a few more minutes, Tommy asking questions about the various features while I basked in the attention. A few other drivers had gathered around, nodding appreciatively, asking about performance and comfort. This was my moment. After years of grinding, of sleeping 4 hours a night to make extra runs, of eating nothing but truck stop sandwiches to save money, I'd finally made it to the top tier of owner-operators. "You boys admiring the future of trucking?" The voice was raspy, weathered, with a hint of amusement. I turned to see a woman approaching from the direction of the repair bay. She looked to be in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore faded coveralls, stained with years of grease and oil, and carried a toolbox that looked like it had survived at least 3 wars. Her face was deeply lined, tanned from decades under the sun, but her eyes were sharp and bright. "This is Rose McKenzie," Tommy said. "She runs the repair shop here. Best mechanic between here and Seattle." Rose set down her ancient toolbox with a thud that sent up a small cloud of dust. Mighty pretty truck you got there, son. All that chrome and those fancy computers. There was something in her tone that put me on edge. Not quite mockery, but not quite respect either. Thanks, I said cautiously. She's got every modern safety and diagnostic feature available. Rose walked slowly around the Peterbilt, her practiced eye taking in every detail. She stopped at the front wheel, squatted down with a slight grunt, and examined the tire. Then she stood up and peered into the engine. Compartment through the grille. Computer tells you everything, does it? Pretty much, I said, my pride pushing aside caution. I can pull up real-time diagnostics on any system in the truck. Engine performance, transmission health, brake wear, even tells me when I'm due for an oil change. Takes all the guesswork out of maintenance. Rose nodded slowly, then walked over to her toolbox and flipped it open. Inside was a collection of tools that belonged in a museum. Wrenches with worn handles, screwdrivers with chipped grips, a tire pressure gauge that looked like it predated the interstate highway system. Everything was meticulously organized, but everything was also undeniably old. Well, she said, when those fancy computers fail, you just remember us old-timers are still around, been fixing trucks since before you were born, with nothing but these here tools and my own two hands. Something about her tone, that old-school condescension, sparked my irritation. I'd heard it before. From guys like her, the dinosaurs who refused to accept that the industry had evolved beyond their grease-under-the-fingernails era. They always acted like new technology was somehow cheating, like you weren't a real trucker, unless you could rebuild an engine blindfolded. No offense, I said, but those tools look like they're from the Stone Age. Everything you can do with those, my truck's computer can do better and faster. I mean, why would I trust a manual tire gauge from the 1970s when I've got digital sensors that are accurate to 1/10 of a PSI? A few of the gathered drivers shifted uncomfortably. Tommy looked down at his feet. Rose just smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Is that so? She said quietly. Look, I respect the old ways, I continued, unable to stop myself now that I'd started. But this is 2024. Technology has moved on. These trucks are basically computers on wheels now. You need diagnostic equipment, software updates, digital tools. Those antiques in your toolbox might have worked fine 40 years ago, but they're obsolete now. Rose closed her toolbox with a deliberate click. Obsolete, she repeated, tasting the word. Well, I've been called worse. Your fancy computer tell you what that little vibration in your front end is? I froze. What vibration? The one that started about 2 minutes before you pulled in. Noticed it when you were turning into the lot. Slight wobble in the left front wheel. Your computer mentioned that to you? I felt my face flush. The diagnostic system would alert me to any issues. Would it now? Rose picked up her toolbox. Well, good luck with that, son. Hope that computer of yours knows what it's doing. She started walking back toward the repair bay, then paused and called over her shoulder. When it figures out what's wrong, you know where to find me. I'll be in the shop with my obsolete tools. The gathered drivers began to disperse, the show apparently over. Tommy gave me a sympathetic look before heading toward the diner. I stood there alone next to my beautiful, expensive truck, feeling foolish and angry in equal measure. There was no vibration. The old woman was just trying to save face after I'd called out her outdated methods. I climbed back into the cab and checked the diagnostic screen. Everything showed green across the board. All systems normal. Engine temperature perfect. Tire pressure exactly where it should be. Transmission functioning flawlessly. See, I told myself, the computer knows everything. That old mechanic was just bitter. I had a delivery scheduled in Spokane, Washington, 300 miles west. The load was sitting in my trailer already, 42,000 pounds of manufactured parts for a factory there. I needed to get moving if I was going to make my delivery window. I started the engine, enjoying the smooth purr of the brand new motor, and pulled out of the truck stop. The highway stretched ahead of me, Interstate 90 cutting through the Montana. Landscape like a ribbon. The Peterbilt handled like a dream, responding to every input with precision. The adaptive cruise control maintained my speed perfectly, adjusting for the gentle hills without me having to touch the pedal. The air conditioning kept the cab at a comfortable 72 degrees, despite the blazing sun outside. For the first hour, everything was perfect. I listened to my favorite podcast, sipped on the coffee I'd grabbed from the truck stop, and enjoyed the ride. The key computer screen showed optimal fuel efficiency, the engine running like a Swiss watch. This was what $200,000 bought you. Not just a truck, but peace of mind. Then, about 70 miles into my trip, I felt it. A vibration, slight but unmistakable, coming from the front left side of the truck. It was subtle at first, just a tiny tremor that I might have imagined, but as the miles ticked by, it grew more pronounced. The steering wheel developed a slight shimmy, especially when I hit speeds above 60 miles per hour. I glanced at the diagnostic screen, still all green. No warnings, no alerts, no indication that anything was wrong, but I could feel it in my hands, in the way the truck was handling. Something wasn't right. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe just a rough patch of road, maybe the wind. The computer would tell me if there was a real problem, and the computer said everything was fine. Rose Mackenzie had just gotten into my head with her country wisdom. Routine. There was no way she could have diagnosed a problem just by watching me pull into the parking lot. By mile 100, the vibration had become impossible to ignore. The steering wheel was shaking noticeably now, and I could hear a faint, rhythmic thumping sound coming from somewhere up front. Other drivers were starting to give me strange looks as they passed, and one trucker even got on the CB to ask if I knew my rig was wobbling. I pulled over at the next rest area, my heart sinking. The diagnostic screen still showed no problems. I got out and walked around the truck, examining every inch of the front end. The tires looked fine to my untrained eye. Nothing appeared loose or damaged. But when I put my hand on the left front fender while the engine was running, I could feel the vibration clearly. Something was definitely wrong, and my state-of-the-art computer system had no idea what it was. I pulled out my phone and searched for nearby repair shops. There was a truck service center about 30 miles ahead, but when I called, they said they were booked solid for the next 2 days. I tried 3 other places with similar results. It was Saturday afternoon, and apparently everyone's truck decided to break down at the same time. The temperature gauge on my phone showed it was now 98 degrees outside. Inside the cab with the AC running, I was comfortable, but I could see the heat shimmering off the pavement. If I broke down out here, if whatever was wrong got worse and left me stranded on the side of the highway in this heat with 42,000 pounds of freight, I didn't want to do it. My pride screamed against it, but I knew I didn't have much choice. I pulled up the number for Rocky Ridge Truck Stop and asked for the repair shop. Mackenzie's Garage, this is Rose. That raspy voice, now coming through my phone speaker, somehow sounded even more knowing than it had in person. I took a deep breath. Ms. Mackenzie, this is Derek Matthews. I was at your shop earlier today, the one with the new Peterbilt, the one with all the fancy computers, she said. I remember. Yeah, well, you were right. There's something wrong with the front left wheel. There's a vibration, and it's getting worse. My diagnostic system isn't showing any problems, but I can feel it in the steering wheel, and I can hear it. There was a pause. I could almost see her satisfied smile. Where are you now? She asked. About 30 miles west on I-90 at the Deer Creek rest area. Stay put. I'll be there in 40 minutes. You're coming here? I couldn't keep the surprise out of my voice. Can't very well fix your truck if you're not here and I'm there, can I? Besides, sounds like you might not make it back without causing more damage. Sit tight and don't try to drive it anymore. She hung up before I could respond. I sat in my truck at the rest area watching other vehicles come and go. Families on road trips, RVs headed for the national parks, other trucks making their deliveries. The minutes crawled by. I checked the diagnostic screen obsessively, as if staring at it would suddenly make it reveal what was wrong. It remained stubbornly green, all systems normal, everything fine. Except everything wasn't fine. 43 minutes later, I saw a dusty Ford F-250 pull into the rest area, towing a small equipment trailer. Rose Mackenzie climbed out, grabbed her ancient toolbox, and walked over to my truck like she had all the time in the world. "Well," she said, setting down the toolbox, "let's see what we've got here." I climbed down from the cab, feeling like a scolded child. "The computer still says everything's fine." "Computers are wonderful things," Rose said, already squatting next to the front left wheel. "But they can only tell you about what they're designed to measure. And sometimes the sensors fail before the parts they're monitoring." She pulled out that ancient tire pressure gauge and checked the tire. Then she produced a flashlight that looked like it had served in World War II and examined the wheel assembly, her face inches from the metal. She grunted, reached into her toolbox, and pulled out a wrench. "Hand me that jack from my trailer," she said. I did as instructed, and watched as she positioned it under the frame. The truck rose slowly, lifting the wheel off the ground. Rose spun the tire with her hand, watching it carefully. Then she grabbed the tire at the top and bottom and rocked it back and forth. "There's your problem," she said, pointing. "Wheel bearings going out. See that play? Shouldn't be able to move like that. Another 50 miles and this wheel would have locked up on you. At highway speed that would have been... Well, let's just say you're lucky you stopped when you did." I leaned in to look where she was pointing. Sure enough, I could see the wheel moving slightly on the spindle when she pushed on it. But the sensor should have detected that. There's a whole system that monitors the bearings. "Should have," Rose agreed. "Probably would have eventually. But sensors can lag behind reality. They measure temperature and vibration, but sometimes a bearing goes bad faster than the computer expects. That's why you still need someone who knows what to look for." She opened her toolbox and began pulling out tools. Everything she needed was right there, organized by decades of habit. Socket wrenches, bearing pullers, grease guns, all ancient but perfectly maintained. She worked. With the efficiency of long practice, her weathered hands moving with surprising grace and precision. "This is going to take me about 2 hours," she said. "I've got spare bearings in my trailer. Lucky for you, your fancy new truck still uses standard parts. Go get yourself some lunch at the rest stop there. Stay out of this heat. I'll have you rolling again before dinner." I wanted to say something, to apologize for my earlier comments, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just nodded and walked toward the rest stop building. My expensive truck sitting there with its hood open, being repaired by a woman with tools older than I was. The rest stop had a small food court and some picnic tables under a covered area. I bought a sandwich I didn't want and sat watching Rose work. Even from a distance, I could see her methodical approach. Every movement was purposeful, every tool used with practiced efficiency. She wasn't fighting with stuck bolts or struggling with unfamiliar systems. She knew exactly what she was doing. Other truckers came and went, some stopping to chat with Rose, others just watching her work with respect. I overheard one conversation where a younger driver asked her about a problem with his transmission, and she diagnosed it in about 30 seconds just from his description. She didn't have a computer readout, didn't need to plug in diagnostic equipment, just decades of experience and an intimate understanding of how trucks worked. True to her word, Rose had the repair completed in just under 2 hours. I watched as she lowered the truck back down, spun the wheel to check her work, then wiped her hands on a rag that was only slightly less ancient than her tools. "All set," she called out. "Come test it out." I climbed into the cab and started the engine. The vibration was completely gone. The truck felt solid again, stable, like it had when I first drove it off the dealer's lot. I rolled forward slowly, then accelerated, smooth as silk. Rose was packing up her tools when I climbed back down. "How much do I owe you?" I asked, pulling out my wallet. She named a price that was surprisingly reasonable, probably half what a dealership would have charged. I handed her the cash, plus an extra 100 as a tip, which she accepted with a small nod. "Thank you," I said, and this time I meant it with every fibre of my being. "You saved me out here. If that bearing had failed while I was driving, you'd have been in a bad spot," she finished. "Probably would have destroyed your wheel, maybe damaged your axle, could have caused a wreck. That's a heavy load you're pulling." "I'm sorry," I said, the words finally coming. "What I said earlier about your tools being obsolete. That was ignorant and disrespectful. You knew something was wrong before my computer did, and you fixed it with equipment I made fun of." Rose closed her toolbox and looked at me with those sharp eyes. "Your computer's not wrong, son. It's a valuable tool, and it'll serve you well. But tools are only as good as the person using them. A fancy diagnostic machine in the wrong hands is worthless, and an old wrench in the right hands can save your life. The trick is knowing when to trust the technology and when to trust your instincts." "You could have refused to help me," I said, "after what I said." "Could have," she agreed, "but that's not who I am. You needed help, I could provide it. Simple as that. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "everyone's young and stupid at least once in their lives, some of us more than once." She loaded her toolbox and Jack back onto her trailer. "You should make your delivery just fine now, but when you get back this way, stop in at my shop. That computer of yours might not have caught this problem early, but it should have eventually. Might want me to check why the sensor didn't register the bearing wear. Could be a calibration issue." "I will," I promised. "Definitely." Rose climbed into her old Ford, started the engine with a rumble that my Peterbilt would never make, and pulled out of the rest area. I watched her drive away, that dusty truck and trailer disappearing down the highway, carrying tools and knowledge that had just saved my $200,000 mistake from becoming a catastrophe. I got back in my truck, checked the diagnostic screen one more time. Still showing all green, still completely unaware of how close we'd come to disaster, and pulled back onto the interstate. The truck handled perfectly now, steady and solid. But something had changed. Every time I glanced at that fancy computer screen with all its reassuring green lights, I remembered Rose squatting next to my wheel with her ancient flashlight, spotting a problem that all my technology had missed. The sun was setting behind me now, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and purple. I had a delivery to make, miles to cover, and a lot to think about. The truck might be mine, but I was beginning to realize that owning it and truly understanding it were two very different things. My phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. "Everything okay? Heard you had trouble." I typed back, "Yeah, Rose Mackenzie saved my ass. She was right about the vibration." His response came quickly. "She usually is. Best mechanic I ever met." I set the phone down and focused on the road ahead, the white lines disappearing under my wheels, the weight of my cargo steady behind me. I'd learned something today, something important, but I had a feeling the lesson wasn't over yet. The delivery in Spokane went off without a hitch. I backed into the loading dock at 6:47 a.m. on Sunday morning, 3 minutes ahead of my scheduled window. The warehouse guys unloaded my 42,000 pounds of manufactured parts with practiced efficiency, and by 8:15 I was pulling out of the facility with an empty trailer, already checking my load board for the next job. The irony wasn't lost on me that my expensive, computer-laden truck had performed flawlessly once Rose Mackenzie had fixed what my diagnostic system couldn't detect. Every mile of that final leg into Spokane, I'd been hyper-aware of every sound, every vibration, every tiny detail of how the truck was handling. But everything had been perfect. The repair was solid. I found a return load fairly quickly. A shipment of industrial packaging materials headed to Billings, Montana, which would take me right back through Rocky Ridge. The pay was decent, and more. Importantly, it gave me a reason to stop at Rose's garage like I'd promised. I spent Sunday night at a truck stop outside Spokane, catching up on sleep and thinking about what had happened. In the solitude of my sleeper cab, with the lights of the parking lot casting shadows through my curtains, I pulled up information about wheel bearings on my laptop. I read about failure modes, warning signs, and diagnostic challenges. I learned that modern trucks use wheel speed sensors that can detect bearing problems, but that these sensors sometimes fail to register gradual degradation, only catching catastrophic failures. In other words, Rose had been absolutely right. The computer was a valuable tool, but it had limitations. And I, in my arrogance, had assumed that technology had eliminated the need for experience and intuition. Monday morning found me loading the packaging materials in an industrial park on the outskirts of Spokane. The facility was enormous, all concrete and steel, with forklifts buzzing around like industrial bees. I backed my trailer up to the dock and watched through my mirrors as the workers began loading pallets of cardboard boxes, plastic wrapping, and foam insulation materials. "Nice rig," one of the forklift operators said, admiring my Peterbilt as he secured a load. He was a young guy, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded me of myself a decade ago. "That's one of the new 579s, right? Heard these things practically drive themselves." "They're pretty advanced," I admitted, "but they still need someone who knows what they're doing behind the wheel." "Man, I'd love to be a trucker someday," he said, positioning another pallet. "Just you, the road, seeing the country. Seems like freedom, you know?" I thought about the reality of trucking, the long hours, the time away from home, the constant pressure to make deliveries on time, the toll it took on your body and relationships. But I also thought about watching the sun rise over the Rockies, about that feeling of independence, about being your own boss. "It's a good life," I said, "if you're willing to work for it, and if you're willing to keep learning. The day you think you know everything is the day you get in trouble." He nodded, though I wasn't sure he really understood what I meant. How could he? I hadn't understood it myself until Saturday. By 11 a.m., I was loaded and secured, my paperwork signed, and my GPS showing a 6-hour drive to Billings. I pulled out of the industrial park and headed east on I-90, retracing my route from 2 days earlier. The truck handled beautifully, the load well balanced, the weather cooperating with clear skies and mild temperatures. I made good time through Idaho, stopping only once for fuel and a quick lunch. The landscape changed gradually as I drove, from the evergreen forests of the Pacific Northwest to the more arid terrain as I approached Montana. This was a route I'd driven dozens of times, familiar, landmarks appearing and disappearing in my mirrors. As I crossed back into Montana, my thoughts turned increasingly to Rocky Ridge Truck Stop and Rose Mackenzie's garage. I'd told her I would stop by, but now I found myself actually looking forward to it. Not just because she'd asked me to have her check the sensor, but because I wanted to understand more about what she did and how she did it. I pulled into Rocky Ridge around 4:30 in the afternoon. The place looked different somehow, though. Nothing had physically changed. Maybe I was just seeing it through different eyes. I parked my rig in the lot and walked toward the repair bay, where I could see someone working under the hood of a Kenworth. "Be right with you," came a voice from under the hood, Rose's voice, though I couldn't see her. "Just finishing up here." I waited, watching as she completed whatever adjustment she was making. After a moment, she emerged, wiping her hands on that same old rag. She looked exactly as she had. On Saturday, coveralls stained with decades of work, hair pulled back practically, eyes sharp and alert. "Mr. Matthews," she said, a slight smile touching her weathered face. "Made your delivery okay, I see." "Thanks to you," I said. "Truck ran perfectly all the way to Spokane and back." "Good, that's how it should be." She walked over to a workbench and set down the wrench she'd been holding. "You here for that sensor check I mentioned? If you have time. Always got time for a learning opportunity." She grabbed her ancient toolbox, I was starting to think of it as a historical artifact, and walked toward my Peterbilt. "Pull her into Bay 2. I'll get my diagnostic equipment." I drove my truck into the bay as directed, the massive overhead door swallowing the rig. The garage was cleaner than I'd expected, well organized despite being clearly old. Tools hung on pegboards in precise arrangements, parts were labeled and shelved systematically, and the concrete floor, though stained with years of oil and grease, was swept clean. Rose returned carrying something I hadn't expected, a laptop connected to a modern diagnostic scanner. She saw my surprise and chuckled. "What, you thought I only used tools from the Stone Age?" she said, using my own words from Saturday. "I keep up with technology, son, have to, the way these trucks are built now. The difference is I don't let the technology do all my thinking for me." She plugged the scanner into my truck's diagnostic port and opened her laptop. Within seconds, she was navigating through screens of data that looked just as complex as anything I'd seen at the dealership. "Let's see what your computer knows about that wheel bearing," she murmured, her fingers moving across the keyboard with surprising speed. There it is, see this?" She turned the laptop so I could see. The screen showed a graph with several colored lines, tracking different measurements over time. "This green line is your wheel speed sensor data. For that front left wheel," Rose explained. "Notice anything?" I studied the graph. "It looks normal?" "Exactly. It looks normal because the sensor was failing gradually. See, a wheel bearing doesn't usually fail all at once. It degrades over time. As it wears, it creates slightly more friction, generates a bit more heat, causes tiny variations in wheel rotation. A properly functioning sensor should catch those variations and flag them as potential bearing wear." She zoomed in on a portion of the graph. "But if the sensor itself is degrading, which happens, they're not infallible, then it smooths out those variations. It's like trying to listen to someone whisper while wearing earplugs. The information is there, but you can't quite hear it. So the sensor was the problem." "The sensor was part of the problem," Rose corrected. "The bearing was the main issue. But yes, your sensor wasn't sensitive enough to catch the early warning signs. Look here." She pulled up another screen. "I'm running a diagnostic on the sensor itself now. See this calibration drift? It's minor, within acceptable parameters according to the manufacturer's specs, but it's enough to mask subtle bearing wear." I watched as she worked, explaining each step. She recalibrated the sensor using her diagnostic equipment, then had me start the truck and drive it slowly through the bay while she monitored the readings. "Better," she said, studying the laptop screen. "You're getting cleaner data now. If this bearing starts to wear again, you should get an alert much earlier." "How did you learn all this?" I asked. "The computer stuff, I mean. It's so different from the old mechanical systems." Rose closed her laptop and unplugged the scanner. "By paying attention and not being afraid to admit what I don't know. When these computerized systems started showing up in trucks back in the late 90s, I had a choice. I could either learn them or become obsolete for real. So I took classes, read manuals, talked to engineers, made mistakes, and kept learning." She gestured to her toolbox. "These old tools still work for mechanical problems, and they'll never need a software update. But the diagnostic scanner helps me understand what the truck's computer is thinking. I use both. That's the key, understanding that every tool has its place." "I made a lot of assumptions," I said quietly. "Yes, you did." Rose's tone was matter-of-fact, not unkind. "You assumed that new meant better, that expensive meant superior, that technology eliminated the need for skill and experience. Those are common mistakes, especially for young folks who've grown up with computers, but you learned from it, and that's what matters." She began putting away her equipment, moving with that same practiced efficiency I'd noticed before. "You know what the real problem is with a lot of modern systems? Not the technology itself. That's impressive stuff. The problem is that people trust it blindly. They see a green light and assume everything's fine. They get an alert and assume that's the only problem. They forget that computers can only tell you what they're programmed to measure, and sensors can only report what they're designed to detect. But experience can catch what the senses miss, I said, finally understanding. Sometimes. Not always. I'm not claiming to be infallible either. But a good mechanic uses every tool available. The computer data, yes, but also their eyes, ears, hands, nose, and that feeling. In their gut that says something's not quite right. That's what I was doing when you pulled into the lot on Saturday. I heard your engine, saw how your truck was moving, noticed that tiny wobble in the wheel. My ears and eyes caught what your computer missed. A thought occurred to me. How long have you been doing this? Rose smiled, a distant look coming into her eyes. Started working on trucks when I was 16 years old back in 1970. My daddy ran a small garage in Nebraska, mostly worked on farm equipment and the occasional truck. I was his only child, and he needed the help. Back then, a girl working on engines raised some eyebrows, but Daddy didn't care about that. He cared about good work. She leaned against my truck's fender, settling into the story. Learned everything from him. How to diagnose a problem by sound, how to feel when a bearing's wearing out, how to read an engine's temperature by the color of the exhaust. When he passed in 1982, I sold the farm and moved out. Here to Montana. Like the mountains, like the independent spirit of the people. Opened this shop in '83, been here ever since. 41 years, I calculated. You've probably forgotten more about trucks than I'll ever know. Maybe, she allowed. But that doesn't mean you can't learn. You've got good instincts, Derek. You knew something was wrong even when your computer said everything was fine. You trusted your senses enough to call for help. That's more than a lot of drivers would do. Some would just keep rolling until something catastrophic happened. The overhead door rumbled open, and another truck pulled up outside. Rose glanced at her watch. That'll be Charlie Brennan, she said. Has a 4:45 appointment for a brake adjustment. You're all set, though. Sensors recalibrated, and I didn't find any other issues. You should be good for your run to Billings. I pulled out my wallet, but Rose waved it away. No charge for the sensor calibration. Consider it part of the original repair. Besides, you already paid me fairly on Saturday, tip included. At least let me buy you dinner, I said. The diner here has to be better than most truck stop food. Rose considered this. Tell you what, I close up at 6. If you're still here, we can grab some food and talk trucks, but I'm not letting you pay. I've got a standing account at the diner. Owner's an old friend. I agreed and moved my truck back out to the main lot. I had some time to kill, so I went into the truck, stopped and bought a soda, then sat at one of the outside picnic tables, watching the sun begin its descent toward the mountains. The temperature was dropping as evening approached, the heat of the day giving way to the comfortable coolness that made Montana summers bearable. Other trucks came and went. Some stopped at the fuel pumps, others parked for the night. A few pulled into Rose's garage for various repairs. I watched her work on Charlie Brennan's brakes, then help a young driver diagnose an electrical problem, then check the transmission on an older Freightliner. Every customer seemed to know her, trust her, respect her. At 6:03, Rose emerged from the garage, having changed out of her coveralls into a simple flannel shirt and jeans. She locked up the bay doors and walked over to where I was sitting. Ready for some mediocre meatloaf? She asked. That's the dinner special? Every Monday. Betty makes it with too much onion and not enough salt, but she serves it with real mashed potatoes and gravy so it balances out. The diner was about half full, mostly truckers and a few locals. We took a booth by the window, and a waitress who looked to be about Rose's age came over immediately. The usual, Rose, she asked. Please, Betty, and my friend here will have... I'll try the meatloaf, I said. Betty wrote it down without comment and headed back to the kitchen. Rose poured sugar into her coffee, more sugar than I would have thought possible, and settled back in the booth. So, she said, tell me about that truck of yours. What made you want to spend $200,000 on a rig? I told her about my years of saving, the dream of owning the best equipment, the belief that top-of-the-line technology would give me an edge in the business. As I talked, I heard myself justifying decisions, explaining my reasoning, defending my choices. Rose listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, sipping her overly sweet coffee. When I finally wound down, she set her cup on the table and looked at me thoughtfully. "Nothing wrong with any of that," she said. "Good equipment is worth the investment, and that Peterbilt is a fine truck. But let me ask you something. Before Saturday, when's the last time you looked at that truck without relying on your computer to tell you what to look at?" I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it. I honestly couldn't remember. "I thought so," Rose said gently. "You've been letting the computer do all your thinking. It's easy to do. The technology is designed to make things simple, but simple isn't always the same as smart." Betty returned with our food. The meatloaf did indeed have too much onion, but the mashed potatoes were creamy perfection, and the gravy was rich and savory. We ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. "I want to learn," I said finally. "What you do, how you do it, not just the computer diagnostics, but the other stuff, how to really understand my truck." Rose paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. "That's a serious commitment, not something you pick up in an afternoon." "I know, but I'm out here on the road all the time. Whenever I come through Rocky Ridge, could I don't know, could I watch you work, ask questions, maybe help out sometimes?" She studied me for a long moment, those sharp eyes seeming to look right through me. Finally, she nodded. "I can work with that, but I've got conditions. First, when I'm teaching you something, you don't argue or make excuses. You listen, you learn, you ask questions if you don't understand, but you don't tell me about what your computer says or what you read online. Second, you pull your weight. If you're in my shop, you work. Even if it's just sweeping floors or organizing tools, you contribute. And third, you respect the knowledge that came before you. Those old tools might seem obsolete to you, but they represent decades of innovation and refinement. You learn to appreciate them." "Deal," I said. "Immediately." "Good. When's the next time you'll be through this way?" "I've got a run to Seattle at the end of this week. Should be back through here on Saturday." "Saturday works. Show up around 8 in the morning. Wear clothes you don't mind getting dirty and be ready to learn. And Derek," she pointed her fork at me, "bring that manual for your truck's computer system. The whole thing, not just the quick start guide. If I'm going to teach you about your rig, you're going to understand every system in it, mechanical and digital." I spent the rest of dinner asking Rose about her years in the business, listening to stories about the evolution of trucking technology, learning about problems she'd solved and challenges she'd overcome. She had a gift for teaching, explaining complex concepts in simple terms, using metaphors and examples that made sense. As we were finishing up, Tommy Rodriguez came into the diner and spotted us. He walked over, looking surprised to see us together. "Derek, heard your truck's running good again." "Thanks to Rose," I said, "and actually I'm going to be learning from her. Starting this Saturday." Tommy's eyes widened. "Seriously? Man, that's amazing. Rose doesn't take on students very often." "Had a few over the years," Rose said modestly. "Most don't stick with it. It's harder than they think." "I'll stick with it," I promised. After dinner, I walked Rose back to her truck. The sun had set completely now, and the Montana sky was ablaze with stars, unpolluted by city lights. My Peterbilt sat in the lot, chromed, gleaming under the parking lot lights, looking every bit as expensive and impressive as it had when I'd driven it off the dealer's lot. But now when I looked at it, I saw something different. I saw a machine I owned but didn't fully understand, filled with systems I'd trusted blindly, dependent on technology I couldn't maintain or repair myself. It was still a beautiful truck, still worth every penny I'd paid for it. But it was no longer just a status symbol or a testament to my success. It was a responsibility, and I was finally ready to live up to it. "See you Saturday," Rose said, climbing into her old Ford. 8 a.m. sharp, I confirmed. I watched her drive away, then walked back to my truck. I had a delivery to make in Billings tomorrow, and I needed to get some sleep. But first, I pulled out the owner's manual for my Peterbilt, all 847 pages of it, and started reading from the beginning. I had a lot to learn, and I was finally ready to start learning it. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, clear weather that made Montana famous. I pulled into Rocky Ridge truck stop at 7:52 a.m., 8 minutes early, wearing my oldest jeans and a t-shirt I wouldn't mind ruining. The owner's manual for my Peterbilt sat in a bag on the passenger seat, along with a notebook and pen. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it right. Rose's garage was already open, the bay doors rolled up to let in the cool morning air. I could hear country music playing on a radio somewhere inside, and the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the familiar scents of oil and metal. I parked my rig in the lot and walked over, carrying my bag of study materials. "Morning," Rose called out from under the hood of an older Volvo truck. "Coffee's on the workbench. Help yourself. And grab me a cup while you're at it. Black, no sugar." I found the coffee pot on a corner workbench, next to a collection of mugs that looked like they'd survived multiple decades. I poured 2 cups, remembering she'd loaded her dinner coffee with sugar. "You said black," I called out. "Coffee at work is different than coffee at dinner," she replied. "Need the bitterness to wake up, need the sweetness to wind down." I brought her the coffee, and she emerged from under the hood to accept it. She took a long sip, nodded in satisfaction, and set the mug on a fender. "What are you working on?" I asked. "Cooling system on this old Volvo. Owner's been having overheating issues. Computer says the thermostat's fine, but the computer's wrong. Thermostat's sticking partially closed, restricting coolant flow. Not enough to trigger a fault code, but enough to cause problems under load." She gestured for me to come closer. "Look here, see this coolant hose? Put your hand near it. Don't touch it, just near it. What do you feel?" I held my hand close to the hose. "Heat? Right. But now come over here to this other hose." We moved to the other side of the engine. "Same thing. Hand near it. What do you feel?" I did as instructed. "It's cooler. Noticeably cooler." "Exactly. Both hoses should be close to the same temperature when the engine's been running. This one's cooler because less coolant is flowing through it. The thermostat's restricting flow. A temperature sensor can't tell you that. It just measures the coolant temperature at one specific point. But your hand, moving between different parts of the system, can feel the difference." She reached into her toolbox and pulled out an infrared thermometer. Not an old tool, I noticed, but not exactly cutting edge either. Of course, we can verify it with this. But I knew before I measured. Years of putting my hands near engines taught me what normal feels like. Over the next hour, I watched Rose replace the thermostat. She explained every step, showed me how to properly drain and refill the cooling system, demonstrated the correct way to burp air from the lines. She let me do some of the work myself, under her supervision, correcting my grip on tools or my approach to a fastener. "You're too tentative," she said, when I was struggling with a stubborn bolt. "That bolt's not going to break if you put some muscle into it. Feel the resistance. If it's rust or corrosion making it tight, you can power through. If it's cross-threaded or damaged, you'll feel a different kind of resistance, a grinding, wrong feeling. Learn to tell the difference." I tried again, putting more force into it, and felt the bolt suddenly give way. "Got it! Good. Now, as you're removing it, pay attention to the threads. Any damage? Any metal shavings? Any signs of wear?" I examined the bolt carefully. "Looks clean." "Right. That's good. Means we can reuse it safely. If you saw damaged threads or metal particles, you'd want to replace it. Small things like that prevent future problems." By the time we finished the Volvo, it was nearly 10 a.m. Rose started the engine and let it run, monitoring temperatures with her infrared thermometer and checking the diagnostic readouts on her laptop. Everything looked good. "Owner's picking it up this afternoon," she said, wiping her hands on her rag. "Now, let's take a look at that manual you brought. We spread the Peterbilt manual out on her workbench, and Rose started flipping through sections, occasionally pausing to read a particular passage or study a diagram. I'd read the manual myself over the past week, but watching her go through it was different. She knew exactly what to look for, which sections mattered most, what details were critical versus what was just filler. "Here," she said, pointing to a wiring diagram. "This is your wheel speed sensor circuit. See how it's integrated with your ABS system and your traction control. A failure in one can affect the others. That's why when we recalibrated your sensor, I also checked these related systems." She walked me through the electrical schematics, explaining how the various sensors and computers communicated with each other. It was complex, but she broke it down into understandable chunks, using analogies that made sense. "Think of it like a conversation," she said. "The wheel speed sensor is constantly talking to the ABS computer, telling it how fast the wheel is turning. The ABS computer listens, and if it hears something wrong, like one wheel turning slower than the others, it talks to the brake system and says, 'Hey, we might be skidding, better pump.' The brakes. But if the sensor is miscalibrated, it's like someone who mumbles. The message gets garbled, and the system can't respond correctly." A customer pulled up outside, a woman driving a day cab Freightliner looking frustrated. Rose excused herself and went to talk to her. I watched as they discussed the problem, Rose asking questions, the driver demonstrating something about how the steering was feeling loose. Within 5 minutes, Rose had the truck in the bay and was checking the steering linkage. "Want to learn about steering systems?" she called out to me. For the rest of the morning, I was Rose's unofficial apprentice. I handed her tools, held flashlights, crawled under trucks to look at what she was pointing out. She explained the mechanics of power steering, showed me how to identify wear in ball joints, demonstrated how to check for play in tie rods. Every repair was a teaching opportunity, every problem a chance to learn something new. Around noon, we broke for lunch. Rose locked up the garage and we walked over to the diner. Saturday was apparently meatloaf day again, but this time Betty had gotten the onion to salt ratio right. "You're picking this up faster than I expected," Rose said between bites. "Most people get overwhelmed by all the different systems and how they interact." "I've been reading the manual every night this week," I admitted, "and watching YouTube videos about truck maintenance." "YouTube's good for some things," Rose said, "but be careful. Lots of misinformation out there too. And videos can't teach you how something feels or sounds. That only comes from hands-on experience." "How long did it take you to get really good at this?" I asked. Rose considered the question. "Depends on what you mean by really good. I could do basic repairs and maintenance within a year of starting with my daddy. Could diagnose most common problems within 3 or 4 years. But really understanding trucks, not just fixing them, but understanding them at a deep level. That took a decade, maybe more, and I'm still learning new things." "After 54 years, you're still learning?" "Technology keeps changing. New systems, new problems, new solutions. The day I stop learning is the day I should retire." She took a sip of her coffee. "But the fundamentals don't change. Internal combustion engines still work the same way they did 50 years ago. Hydraulics and pneumatics follow the same principles. Friction is still friction. Heat is still heat. Once you understand those fundamentals, the new stuff is just variations on a theme." After lunch, we returned to find 3 more trucks waiting for service. Rose looked at the line and smiled. "Welcome to Saturday afternoon, our busiest time. You ready to work?" For the next 6 hours, I got a crash course in high-volume truck repair. Rose moved from truck to truck with impressive efficiency, diagnosing problems, making repairs, managing customer expectations. I did whatever she asked, fetching tools, cleaning parts, taking notes, occasionally being allowed to do simple tasks under her watchful eye. One repair stood out. A driver had brought in a newer Kenworth with engine problems. The diagnostic computer showed multiple fault codes related to the emission system, suggesting the diesel particulate filter needed to be replaced. The repair would cost thousands of dollars. Rose studied the codes, then did something I didn't expect. She cleared them all and took the truck for a test drive, with me riding along. She drove it hard, accelerating aggressively, engine braking down hills, really putting it through its paces. "Listen to that," she said, pointing at the exhaust note during a hard acceleration. "Hear how clean it sounds? No black smoke, no rough running. If the DPF was actually clogged, we'd hear it struggling." Back at the shop, she connected her diagnostic equipment again. Some codes had returned, but not all of them. She studied the data carefully, then crawled under the truck to inspect the exhaust system physically. "There's your problem," she called out. "Come look at this." I crawled under the truck beside her. She was pointing at a connector on one of the sensors, a plug that connected wiring to the exhaust system. "See that corrosion? Water got into the connector, created false readings. The computer thought the DPF was failing because the sensor was giving it bad data. All those fault codes were symptoms, not the actual problem." She cleaned the connector, applied some dielectric grease, and reconnected it. Another test drive showed all systems normal. "You just saved that driver probably $4,000, I said. "I did my job," Rose corrected. "A less experienced mechanic might have just replaced the DPF based on the fault codes. A dishonest mechanic definitely would have. But the codes are just information. You have to interpret them in context, verify them with physical inspection, use your experience. To separate symptoms from causes. Does that happen a lot? Computers throwing false fault codes? More than you'd think. Sensors fail, connectors corrode, wiring gets damaged. The computer can only report what it's being told by its sensors. Garbage in, garbage out. That's why you can't just trust the diagnostic readout blindly. You have to verify. By the time Rose closed up at 6 p.m., I was exhausted but exhilarated. My clothes were filthy. My hands were covered in grease despite repeated washings. And I was pretty sure I smelled like diesel fuel and old coolant. But I'd learned more in 10 hours than I'd learned in the past 12 years of driving. "Same time next week?" Rose asked, as she was locking the bay doors. "Definitely, if you'll have me. You worked hard today. Didn't complain, didn't slack off, ask good questions. I'll have you." She paused. "But Derek, I want you to understand something. What I'm teaching you, it's going to take years to really master. You might learn enough to handle basic maintenance and simple repairs, but becoming a truly skilled mechanic takes time and lots of mistakes. Don't get overconfident just because you know more than you did this morning. I understand. I'm not trying to replace you or become a full-time mechanic. I just want to understand my truck better, be able to handle small issues myself, and know enough to tell when something's really wrong versus when it's just the computer being paranoid." Rose nodded approvingly. "That's a good goal. Realistic and practical. Keep that attitude, and you'll do fine." I drove back to my Peterbilt, started the engine, and let it idle for a moment while I listened. Really listened for the first time. The smooth purr of the engine, the slight hiss of the air system, the subtle whir of the cooling fan. All of it sounded normal, healthy. But now I knew what I was listening for. I knew what abnormal would sound like. I checked my diagnostic screen, all green as usual. But I didn't just trust it blindly anymore. I climbed back down and did a walk-around inspection, checking tires, looking for leaks, examining belts and hoses through the grille. Everything looked good, and now I actually knew what good meant. As I pulled out of Rocky Ridge, heading for my next delivery, I felt different. The truck was still the same. I was still the same person, but the relationship between us had changed. Before, I'd been a driver who owned a truck. Now, I was becoming an operator who understood his equipment. My phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. "Heard you spent the day at Rose's shop. How was it?" I typed back, "Best education I've ever had. Doing it again next week." His response, She's the real deal. Learn everything you can from her. I set the phone down and focused on the road ahead. The sun was setting again, painting the sky in those brilliant colors that made you remember why you loved the American West. I had miles to cover, deadlines to meet, a business to run, but I also had a teacher now, and lessons to learn, and a whole new understanding of what it meant to be a professional trucker. The journey was just beginning, and I was finally ready for it. 3 months later, I'd become a regular fixture at Rose's garage. Every Saturday, I came through Rocky Ridge. Word had spread among the regular drivers that I was learning from Rose Mackenzie, and attitudes toward me had shifted. I was no longer just the kid with the expensive truck. I was becoming known as someone who was serious about understanding his equipment. The lessons had continued every week without fail. Rose had taught me about air brake systems, showing me how to properly inspect chambers and slack adjusters. She'd walked me through diesel engine theory, explaining injection timing and turbocharger operation. She'd demonstrated electrical troubleshooting techniques, taught me to read wiring diagrams, and shown me how to use a multimeter effectively, but more than technical skills. She taught me a philosophy: trust but verify. Use the technology, but don't depend on it exclusively. Listen to your instincts. Pay attention to subtle changes and never assume you know everything. It was late October now, and I was hauling a particularly valuable load, $80,000 worth of electronics from Portland to Minneapolis. The route would take me through Montana, across to North Dakota, and down through South Dakota. 3 days of driving if weather cooperated, 4 if it didn't. Weather, as it turned out, wasn't going to cooperate. I'd made it through Montana fine, spent a night in Billings, and was crossing into North Dakota when the first snowflakes started falling. October snow wasn't unusual this far north, but the forecast had called for light flurries, not the heavy, wet snow that was beginning to accumulate on the highway. By the time I reached Dickinson, North Dakota, the snow was coming down hard enough that I decided to stop for the night at a large truck stop off I-94. The parking lot was filling up fast with other drivers making the same decision. Nobody wanted to risk pushing through this weather with the visibility dropping and the roads getting slick. I found a spot in the back of the lot, secured my load, and settled into my sleeper cab for the night. The truck stop was well equipped. Hot showers, decent food, Wi-Fi, everything a stranded driver could want. I used the time to catch up on paperwork, call my dispatcher to update him on the delay, and send Rose a text about the weather conditions. Her response came quickly. Montana got snow too. Roads closed on I-90. Stay safe. Don't push it. I spent the evening in the driver's lounge, swapping stories with other truckers who'd been caught by the early winter storm. There were about 20 of us, ranging from veterans who'd seen 50 winters on the road to younger drivers experiencing their first serious snow. The conversation naturally turned to equipment and technology. These new trucks make winter driving so much easier, one driver was saying. He had a rig similar to mine, all the latest safety features. Traction control, stability management, collision avoidance. It's like having a co-pilot. Still got to know how to drive in snow, an older driver countered. He was maybe 60, driving a well-maintained but obviously older Freightliner. All the computers in the world won't help if you don't understand weight distribution and momentum. Sure, the first driver said, but the technology gives you an extra margin of safety. It catches mistakes before they become accidents. I found myself thinking about Rose's lessons. She'd say they were both right. The technology helped, but it couldn't replace understanding and skill. I was about to contribute to the conversation when my phone rang. It was my dispatcher, Frank, calling from the company's office in Seattle. Derek, I know you're sitting out the storm, but I just got a call from the client. They've got a production line shut down waiting for these electronics. They're willing to pay a premium bonus if you can get the load there by tomorrow night instead of Monday. I walked away from the lounge to hear better. Frank, have you looked at the weather? I-94 is a mess. Highway Patrol is recommending people stay put. I know, but they're talking about a $10,000 bonus, Derek. 5 for the company, 5 for you. And the forecast shows this clearing up by morning. You'd have all day to make the run. $5,000. That would cover almost 2 months of truck payments. I looked out the window at the snow still coming down, accumulating in the parking lot. The smart move was to say no, wait out the weather, deliver safely on Monday. But $5,000 was a lot of money. Let me check the latest forecast, I said. I'll call you back in an hour. I went back to my truck, climbed into the cab, and pulled up weather radar on my tablet. The storm system was large but moving through. The forecast did show clearing conditions by morning, with snow ending around 6 a.m. If I left by 7, I could make Minneapolis by dinner time with no problem. I checked my truck systems. Everything showed green. The Peterbilt was equipped with every safety feature available for winter driving: anti-lock brakes, traction control, roll stability, automatic tire chains that could be deployed from inside the cab if needed. The truck was designed for exactly this kind of condition. Still, something felt wrong. I couldn't articulate what it was, just a nagging sense of unease. I thought about what Rose would say. I thought about her philosophy of trusting instincts. Then I thought about $5,000. I called Frank back. I'll do it, but I'm not leaving until the snow stops and they've had time to clear the roads. That's fine. Client knows there's weather. They just want you moving as soon as it's safe. Thanks, Derek. This is a big help. I tried to sleep but couldn't. The wind was picking up, rocking the truck slightly. Snow continued to pile up outside. Around 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and went back to the driver's lounge for coffee. The older driver with the Freightliner was there, sipping coffee and reading a paperback Western novel. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "Got offered a bonus to push through to Minneapolis tomorrow, trying to decide if it's worth it." He studied me over the rim of his coffee cup. "Let me guess. Good money, tight deadline, client emergency? All of the above. Here's what I've learned in 35 years of driving," he said. "The times I've gotten in trouble weren't when I ignored the obvious dangers. It was when I talked myself into thinking I could handle the not-so-obvious ones. When I convinced myself that my skills or my equipment could overcome questionable conditions." "The forecast shows this clearing up," I said, defending my decision. "Forecasts are wrong all the time, especially in winter, especially in the northern plains." He went back to his book. "But you're going to do what you're going to do. Just be careful out there." I returned to my truck as the first hints of dawn were lighting the eastern sky. The snow had stopped, just as predicted. Road crews were already out clearing I-94. By 7 a.m., the highway was reported as snow-covered but passable, and the truck stop lot was emptying as drivers who'd waited out the storm began heading out. I did a thorough pre-trip inspection. Tires looked good, all systems reporting normal. I started the engine and let it warm up while I checked and double-checked my load securement. Everything was solid. At 7:23 a.m., I pulled out of the truck stop and merged onto I-94 East. The highway was indeed passable, but far from ideal. The road was wet with patches of ice, and there were still several inches of snow on either side. Traffic was light. Most people were being sensible and staying home. The few vehicles on the road were moving carefully, maintaining good following distances. My Peterbilt handled well. The traction control was working perfectly, modulating power to the wheels and preventing any slippage. The heated mirrors kept them clear, and the collision avoidance system monitored the distance to the few vehicles ahead of me. The dashboard showed all systems functioning normally. For the first 50 miles, everything went fine. I maintained a steady 50 miles per hour, below the speed limit but safe for conditions. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, and patches of blue sky were appearing. The forecast had been right. The storm had passed through. Then, about 10 miles past a little town called Gladstone, I felt it. A vibration, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but familiar, exactly like the vibration I'd felt 3 months ago when my wheel bearing had been failing. I immediately checked the diagnostic screen. All green. No warnings, no fault codes, no indication of any problem. I reduced my speed to 45, then 40, focusing on the sensation coming through the steering wheel. The vibration was definitely there, a slight shimmy that grew more pronounced when I hit bumps or rough pavement. I found a wide spot on the shoulder and carefully pulled over. The diagnostic system was still showing everything normal, but Rose's voice was in my head. The computer can only tell you what it's programmed to measure. I climbed down into the cold, morning air. It was maybe 20 degrees, and walked around the truck. All the tires looked properly inflated, no visible damage to any wheels, no fluid leaks, no obvious problems. But when I put my hand on the left front fender and had my assistant driver lean on the brake pedal, there was no assistant, so I used a broom handle to press it from inside. I could feel the vibration. Something was wrong. I didn't know what exactly, but something wasn't right. The smart move would be to call for roadside assistance. But I was in the middle of nowhere, North Dakota. The nearest town with a truck service center was probably an hour away, and I was on a tight deadline for a bonus delivery. I thought about what Rose had taught me. I got my toolbox, a much nicer one than I'd had 3 months ago, but organized according to her principles, and grabbed my tire pressure gauge. Not the digital one that came with the truck, but a manual gauge I'd bought after watching Rose use hers. All 4 tires. On the front axle showed proper pressure. I moved to the drive axles, checking each tire carefully. Everything looked good. Then I checked the trailer axles. The tires looked fine, but when I got to the rear left tire, my manual gauge showed something the truck's sensors had missed. The pressure was low, not catastrophically low, not flat, but about 15 psi lower than it should be. I used my flashlight to examine the tire carefully. There, embedded in the tread, was a piece of metal. Not a nail. Something bigger, maybe a piece of road debris or a chunk from a tire chain. It was causing a slow leak, slow enough that the truck's pressure sensor hadn't registered it yet as a critical issue. A slow leak in a trailer tire wouldn't normally cause a vibration, but combined with the snow-covered road, the weight of my load, and the specific frequency of my speed, it was creating a harmonic that I could feel through the whole rig. If I kept driving, that tire would eventually go flat. On a snow-covered highway at 40 miles per hour, a sudden tire failure on a loaded trailer could cause a jackknife or worse. I grabbed my phone to call for service, then stopped. Rose had taught me more than just diagnostics. She taught me basic repairs, and changing a tire on a trailer axle was something she'd made sure I could do. The temperature was dropping, and light snow was starting to fall again. Not the storm from last night, but enough to make the roadside even more miserable. I set up my warning triangles, positioned my jack, and got to work. Changing a commercial trailer tire in freezing weather on the side of a highway is not fun. It's cold, exhausting work. The lug nuts are huge and require a 4-foot breaker bar to loosen. The tire itself weighs over 100 pounds, and you have to work quickly because every minute you're on the side of the road is a minute some inattentive driver might plow into you. But Rose had trained me well. I knew the procedure, had the right tools, understood the safety precautions. 45 minutes later, I had the spare mounted and the damaged tire secured in the storage rack under the trailer. I was filthy, half frozen, and exhausted, but the vibration was gone. I pulled carefully back onto the highway and continued east. The diagnostic screen still showed all green. It had never registered the tire pressure issue because the leak had been so slow. If I'd trusted the computer exclusively, if I hadn't felt that vibration and investigated it based on my own senses, I would have continued driving until the tire failed completely. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 months ago, I'd mocked Rose's old tools and trusted my computer implicitly. Today, My expensive diagnostic system had missed a critical problem that I'd caught with a $20 manual tire pressure gauge, and the instincts Rose had taught me to trust. I made it to Minneapolis at 6:47 p.m., 13 minutes ahead of the client's deadline. The facility manager was waiting at the dock, relieved to see me. "You're a lifesaver," he said as workers began unloading my trailer. "We've got 3 production lines that have been down since yesterday. This delivery gets us back up and running." I signed the paperwork, collected the bonus confirmation, and found a parking spot in the facility lot. Then I pulled out my phone and called Rose. It was after 8 p.m. Montana time, late for her, but she answered on the second ring. "Derek, everything okay?" I told her the whole story. The bonus offer, the decision to push through, the vibration I'd felt, the tire problem my computer had missed, the roadside repair. When I finished, there was a long silence. "You did good," she said finally. "You trusted your instincts over your computer. You properly diagnosed the problem, and you fixed it safely. That's exactly what I've been trying to teach you." "I thought about what you'd do," I admitted. "Every step of the way I asked myself, what would Rose do?" "That's the highest compliment you could give me," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "But you did it yourself, Derek. You made the right calls." "I almost didn't," I confessed. "I almost just trusted the diagnostic screen and kept driving. The only reason I didn't is because I remembered feeling that vibration 3 months ago, and I remembered you catching it when my computer missed it. That's how learning works. You build on experiences. You remember lessons. You apply them to new situations. You're becoming a real trucker, not just someone who drives a truck." We talked for a few more minutes, then said goodnight. I sat in my cab, the Minneapolis city lights visible in the distance, and thought about how far I'd come in 3 months. I'd started this journey thinking that my expensive truck, with all its advanced technology, made me superior to old-timers like Rose McKenzie. I'd believed that computers and sensors had made experience and intuition obsolete. I'd trusted machines over people, data over instincts, but Rose had taught me something far more valuable than any technology: wisdom. The wisdom to use every tool available, mechanical and digital. The wisdom to trust, but verify. The wisdom to listen to what your equipment is telling you through sounds, vibrations, and subtle changes that no sensor can measure. My phone buzzed with a text from Frank, my dispatcher. "Client confirmed delivery. Bonus will be in your next paycheck. Great work." $5,000. It felt good, but not as good as knowing I'd handled a dangerous situation correctly. Not as good as knowing I'd learned something valuable. Not as good as earning Rose's respect. The following Saturday, I pulled into Rocky Ridge truck stop at 7:55 a.m., 5 minutes early, as had become my habit. Rose was already in the garage, working on a Mack truck's transmission. "Morning," I called out, grabbing my work clothes from the truck. "Morning, coffee's on. How was Minneapolis?" "Educational," I said, pouring us both cups. "Very educational." Word had gotten around about my roadside tire change and the bonus delivery. As I was changing into my work clothes, Tommy Rodriguez pulled up in his Freightliner. Behind him were 3 other trucks, all drivers I'd met over the past few months at Rocky Ridge. "What's going on?" I asked Tommy. "You're kind of famous," he said with a grin. "Guy who learned from Rose and saved his own ass in a North Dakota snowstorm. We were hoping. Maybe you could tell us about it. Show us some of what Rose taught you." Rose walked over, wiping her hands on her perpetual rag. "Seems you've become an inspiration, Derek. These young folks want to learn what you've been learning." I looked at the gathered drivers, all younger than me, all eager to understand their equipment better. I thought about my own journey, about the arrogance I'd started with, and the humility I'd gained. "I'm still learning myself," I said. "Rose is the real teacher." "Here." "True," Rose agreed. "But there's value in learning from someone just a few steps ahead of you on the path. They remember what it's like to be where you are." She turned to the gathered drivers. "Tell you what, Derek here is going to spend the morning helping me with repairs. You're welcome to watch and ask questions, but if you're in my shop, you work. Everyone grabs a broom, a wrench, or a rag. No spectators." The drivers agreed enthusiastically, and suddenly, Rose's one-bay garage became a classroom. As we worked through the day's repairs, a brake job on Tommy's Freightliner, an electrical issue on another driver's Kenworth, routine maintenance on a third truck, Rose and I took turns explaining what we were doing and why. I found myself repeating lessons Rose had taught me, using her analogies and examples. I showed the drivers how to properly use a manual tire pressure gauge, how to check for bearing play, how to interpret fault codes in context rather than just trusting them blindly. And every time I demonstrated something, I made sure to credit Rose with teaching it to me. By lunchtime, all the assembled trucks were repaired, and the drivers were covered in grease and filled with new knowledge. We trooped over to the diner, filling up 2 booths, still talking about trucks and repairs and the relationship between technology and skill. "The thing is," I said, gesturing with a fork, "the computer in my truck is amazing. It monitors hundreds of systems, simultaneously, catches problems I'd never notice, makes driving safer and more efficient. But it's a tool, not a replacement for understanding. You have to know what it's telling you, what it might be missing, and when to trust your own senses over the readout." "That's the balance," Rose added. "Use the technology, but don't be enslaved by it. Combine the old skills with the new tools. That's when you're at your best." After lunch, the other drivers headed out on their various routes. I stayed behind to help Rose finish up a few jobs. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, the radio playing old country songs, the familiar smells and sounds of the garage creating a peaceful atmosphere. "You know," Rose said as we were wrapping up for the day, "when you first showed up here with your fancy new truck and your dismissive attitude, I almost wrote you off. Thought you were just another kid who'd bought his way into equipment he didn't understand and didn't respect." "You would have been right," I admitted, "but you proved me wrong. You listened, you learned, you set aside your pride and admitted what you didn't know. That takes character. That takes maturity." She set down her wrench and looked at me directly. "I'm proud of you, Derek, not just for what you've learned about trucks, but for who you've become as a person." I felt my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Thank you for everything, for teaching me, for being patient with me, for not giving up on me, even when I was acting like an arrogant fool." "Everyone gets to be an arrogant fool at least once," Rose said with a smile. "The important thing is whether you learn from it. You did." As I was getting ready to leave, Rose walked over to her ancient toolbox. She pulled out that old tire pressure gauge, the one I'd mocked 3 months ago as being from the Stone Age. "I want you to have this," she said, holding it out. "Rose, I can't take your... I've got others, and this one's special. My daddy gave it to me when I first started working on trucks in 1970. It's never failed me. Never needed batteries, never needed calibration, never stopped working. It's outlasted probably 20 digital gauges." She pressed it into my hand. "Keep it in your truck. Use it when your fancy sensors are confusing you, and remember that sometimes the old ways are old because they work." I looked down at the gauge, this simple mechanical device that had served faithfully for over 50 years. It felt solid in my hand, real in a way that my digital equipment sometimes didn't. "I'll treasure it," I said, "and I'll use it." That night, as I drove away from Rocky Ridge with a load of agricultural equipment bound for Iowa, I thought about the journey I'd been on. 3 months ago, I'd pulled into this same truck stop thinking I had all the answers, believing my expensive equipment made me superior, dismissing the wisdom of someone who'd forgotten more about trucks than I'd ever known. Now I knew better. I knew that technology was a tool, not a crutch. I knew that experience and instinct were just as valuable as sensors and computers. I knew that true expertise came from combining the old and the new, respecting what came before while embracing what comes next. Most importantly, I knew that I didn't know everything. I was still learning, still growing, still figuring out how to be the best trucker I could be. And that was okay. That was good, actually. The day I thought I knew everything would be the day I stopped improving. My Peterbilt rolled smoothly down the highway, all systems showing green on my diagnostic screen. But I wasn't just trusting the screen anymore. I was listening to the engine, feeling the road through the steering wheel, paying attention to every sensation and sound. And in my toolbox, alongside my modern diagnostic equipment and specialized tools, sat Rose Mackenzie's 54-year-old tire pressure gauge, a simple piece of metal and rubber that had just saved my $200,000 truck from potential disaster, wielded by hands that had learned to trust both technology and tradition. The future of trucking, I realized, wasn't about choosing between old and new. It was about understanding how to use them together. And thanks to Rose, I was finally learning how to do exactly that.